Okay, I think this works now. All right. Okay, so welcome everyone. We have three wonderful panelists here today. To my left, we have Daniel Padilla-Peralta. He is an assistant professor of classics at Princeton University, where he teaches and writes about Roman cultural history and classical reception. His 2015 memoir, Undocumented: A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to Ivy League, received an Alex Award from the American Library Association. And next we have Kayhan Irani. She is an Emmy Award-winning writer, a producer, and a socially engaged artist. She creates arts projects and events to build community and engage audiences in social justice issues. Kayhan was one of 10 artists named by President Obama's White House as a champion of change for her art and storytelling work. And she is currently working on 2 new pieces about immigration, citizenship, and belonging. And she's here visiting us from New York. Next, we have Devesh Kapoor. He is a Madan Lal Sobti Professor for the Study of Contemporary India and Director of the Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania. His more recent books include The Other 1%, Indians in America, Rethinking Public Institutions in India, and Navigating the Labyrinth, Perspectives on India's Higher Education. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. So I am pleased to be in conversation with you, and migrations is a very general topic, but it's also one which is of particular meaning to me. I have lived many places myself and have journeyed many places. I also came to the US as an undocumented immigrant, and I lived as an undocumented immigrant for a very long time, and this was a very trying phase of my life. And it has influenced my current work and interest. So that's one of the ways in which I connect to migrations, you could say. And what I really love about this panel is that you all are coming from different fields and doing very, a range of work, I would say. And so maybe one place for us to start out would be to maybe hear you speak a little bit about how you see yourself as connected to this panel. How did you land here on this panel? Can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself beyond the very brief introduction which I just gave? So can we start with you, Daniel? Yes,
sure. So I come to migrations and to the topic of migrations from several different angles. In the first instance, I grew up undocumented in New York City. I came to the United States as an immigrant from the Dominican Republic with my family, and I spent the ages of 5 to 21 undocumented, first in New York City and then in New Jersey, where I did my undergraduate at Princeton. So the effect of the undocumented experience on my construction of selfhood, on how I constituted my relationships with the many communities in which I found myself, and with how I began to situate myself in dialogue with broader discourses of migration and mobility, were all developed in this period of childhood, adolescence, and youth during which I was undocumented. But then, as I began the process of negotiating my experience, and as I began thinking very seriously about writing a memoir to document my experiences, a project that ultimately bore fruit, I also began to think about how my work in the study of ancient history. By that point, I was becoming very interested in the Greek and Roman world, and I was beginning to think of myself as someone who might pursue the study of migration in ancient history, could interface with some of the work I was doing at that point to speak out on behalf of those who are undocumented and on behalf of immigrant rights more broadly. So that in turn has culminated in a range of different writing projects over the years that have in their own different ways sought to shine a light on how questions of migration and mobility shape the academy and shape academic institutions, whether these are at the post-secondary level or before the post-secondary level, and how the academy and academic institutions in general have an important role to play in moderating, facilitating the conversations about immigration that are taking place, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. Migration and mobility are very much global issues. And so that's why I find myself here at the intersection of these different institutional and social vectors that have left their imprint on my sense of self, but that have also encouraged me to think about how the project of thinking about migration in the 21st century moment ought to be rooted in an appreciation of the historical record, and crucially an appreciation of the historical record as that record is processed through the work of academic and non-academic actors alike.
Thank you.
Awesome. How did I land here? I came from India as a 3-year-old to New York City, where I was raised. My family and my parents are part of a community within India who are migrants, immigrants, refugees from Iran to India. We're called Parsis. We're a Zoroastrian faith, Iranian ethnicity in India. My mother's side comes, her family comes way back. The original migration is somewhat in the 10th century we came to India. But my dad's parents were immigrants from Iran to India. And so my own history and my own stories are multiple layers of migration and movement. And in fact, my parents moved back to Iran in the 70s, thinking like, oh, this might be an interesting place to make a life in the mid-70s. Surprise! And so by the time I was 4 years old, I had lived in 3 countries already and settling in the US. And so these questions of migration, why people migrate, how the migration experience is, but also I'm very particularly concerned with how a nation, how a society sees the migrants and immigrants within that society, and how that affects the values of that society, how that affects the values of the migrants and immigrants themselves, as seeing themselves as important citizens, and I don't mean citizen with a big C, I mean active participants in the society around them, and their rights as legitimate citizens, their rights as legitimate social movers. And so that all has come even into more prominence post 9/11, when the question of who is a worthy citizen American has now really, Arab, South Asian, Muslim people have really fallen into those crosshairs. And so that is what I've been obsessed with in my work, is really looking at who do we value, whose histories are devalued, how does that impact the community themselves, and how does that impact the outside community in seeing, you know, who constitutes a citizenry. For example, how many in here have immigrant heritage? Okay, Boulder's groovy. Yes. Usually, you know, usually not so many people raise their hands, and I think, like, how can a nation that was colonized, that was founded by migrants coming in, have so many people disconnected to that migration history, right? And so I'm obsessed with that, and I play with that, and I think about that, mostly in arts and drama and theater and TV writing.
Thank you, Kayan.
Compared to my colleagues, my journey was much more staid. I came as a student. My journey was much more staid. I came as a student. I was trained in India as a chemical sort of engineer, and when I finished, it was just the done thing that you applied like to the US for a fellowship. We couldn't afford a burger if we, if you didn't get a fellowship. And about 1/3 of my class came here. Over the next decade, 5 of my 6 closest high school friends, we all came and finished our PhDs here. Everyone is a faculty member, but all of us were in the sciences, except me, who then left after. So I came on a fellowship in chemical engineering, but I'd always been interested in other things. But in India, that was the only path. You did engineering or medicine. And by some luck, I got a fellowship at Princeton, where I did my PhD. And then I went to a think tank called the Brookings Institution. And then I went as a faculty, like to Harvard, and from then to Penn. Now, my sort of interest in this actually came from my work on economic development in developing countries. And I began at this question when looking at me and my friends on the impact of the brain drain on developing countries. So what I did was last 15 years I've done 3 books on this, looking at this issue from 3 different angles. One was on sort of global migration of talent, and my co-author was an Irish guy. You need an Indian and an Irish guy to work on some migration. Then I looked at sort of emigration. When I did my first book, I was very intrigued by some new work looking at the impact of the slave trade on Africa. Much of the work on slavery, of course, has been on the impact in the Americas, and of course the impact on the slaves and their families themselves. But I was surprised that there was very little work on how it affected Africa itself. And there's now very good work showing that those, as you can imagine, those effects were very long-term and very deeply pernicious. From that, I moved to a book on the impact of sort of emigration. I began to think, what happens when people leave a place? What happens to that place? And that was on the impact of emigration from India on India. Indians are now the world's largest migrants in the world, by far, if you add. But it's a very large country, so it should not be surprising. But they're also the largest number of high-skilled migrants, which is defined as people with a college degree. That is much more surprising because India is a relatively poor country and education levels are low. And my last book, which looked at the mirror image of emigration, which is immigration, which was on Indians in the United States, and how did a group that came from one of the poorest countries in a single generation end up being the richest immigrant group, both by education and income in one generation. So that's been my journey.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for each sharing your stories. And Kayan, I have a question for you. I know that you describe yourself as an artivist, and I like this word, artivist. And I'm wondering, can you speak a little bit about what you see as the role of us as artists and writers? What role do we play or should we play in the fight for social justice?
I love that question because also it brings up, for me, it brings up the unstated question of pretty much how oftentimes artists are so marginalized in our conversations about what makes a useful, powerful, functioning society. And artists have like, oh, well, here you are, you can tell stories and you can make people happy and you can, kind of do that thing, rather than how fundamental all our knowledge is built upon the stories that we're told, the stories that we're shared. All our knowledge is built upon the arts practices that all of our communities have created in order to raise us, to make sense of our history, to make sense of our current situation, to pass on tradition, to pass on recipes. I mean, there's all art and storytelling in different forms, and I truly believe in story both as a product but also as a process. That as we practice storytelling, we are practicing in my context, we're practicing changing our social relations, because oppression can be this very heady thing. Oh, oppression, and it's structural, and it's in our systems, and smash the system and the institutions. But the institutions are composed of individuals in their social roles relating to one another, and in their historical roles, in their histories of one another. And so how do we understand and rehearse changed social relationships? How do I understand, like, I've been kind of trained to think this way, I've been kind of trained to act this way towards this person or in this type of context, and I got to figure out how I change that, you know. And so you got to improvise, you got to learn improvisation, you got to learn what Boal, who is the creator of a methodology called the theater of the oppressed that I practice, he calls it rehearsal for revolution. How do we rehearse these social roles so that we can practice them in real life, so that we can affect change? And so I look at artists as kind of like the coaches for the revolution. You know, we're like showing the people, like, this is how you do it, and then you do this, and then this one's going to pass it to you, but then you fake it out, and you throw it over there to that one, you know? I mean, we do that through these stories that, you know, a lot has been written on speculative fiction. We're imagining a future that we want to have. Well, we have to keep imagining that future. And the beautiful poet up here yesterday talked about, a teacher of hers asked her, what's your 100-year plan? You know, and so artists are thinking about that 100-year plan. We're thinking about it not, again, as on this very abstract level, but really, what does it look like in terms of my story and your story and our story? So that's what I think.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder whether our role as possible agents of change is always valued, though. Do you think so?
No, I think it depends who. I mean, especially if you talk about, you look at undocumented immigrants, you know, the vital necessity of our society, our economy, on the labor, on the love, on the personhood of undocumented immigrants, it's at the core. And yet we have a powerful national discourse, political discourse, and still can't get through our heads absolutely the essential role of the undocumented immigrant historically in making our society function. And so that is also what the arts does also. It takes, right, the marginal, and it connects them into the truth. It connects them into the truth of their vital personhood in whatever context they're in.
Right.
And then from there you practice.
Yeah.
You know, building, you practice changing your role in relation to the society you're in.
Right, true. Danelle, you have a very intriguing and inspiring story, I feel. And you've spoken about your work in classical literature. And I'm curious to hear more about that. And I'm wondering whether there is something about classical literature or your study of it which somehow gave you sustenance through this journey. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes plenty of sense, actually. So when I was beginning to figure out for myself just what it might mean to study ancient Greek and Roman texts, I came across this interview that Helen Wendler, the poet Helen Wendler, had given in the Paris Review when I was in high school. And she had spoken in that interview of the sustenance that poetry provides, and of the sustenance that can be derived from humanistic study, and how it can, through humanistic study, one can... Wow, I didn't know I could project like that. I hope everyone's ears are okay. And how through humanistic study one can arrive at a sort of enhanced sense of self. So at first, all of this seemed very appealing, and it was very resonant with how I had encountered the classics. My first encounter with ancient Greece and Rome occurred when I was living with my family in New York City's shelter system. I was living in a shelter in Chinatown, Manhattan, and I happened to come across a book on ancient Greece and Rome, and that book enabled me to perform these acts of teleportation in time and space. It enabled me to begin imagining an alterity. However, there's always a however to these stories. It occurred to me later on, as I was approaching the end stages of my undergraduate education and thinking about pursuing graduate education, that encounter with the classics in the shelter came at a cost. Because what I had really been interested in at the time my family and I were living in the shelter, and what I had been pestering my mom to provide me information about, and what I had tried to ransack her brain about was Dominican history. I was really interested in the experiences of my parents and my grandparents. My grandparents had lived under a dictatorship in the Dominican Republic. My dad had grown up under this dictatorship as well. And my mom was full of this information that she transmitted to her two sons about this dictatorship. But I couldn't find books on Dominican history in this shelter. And then later on, when I was spending my afternoons and evenings in the New York Public Library system, hunting around for these books, sometimes I would find a book that mentioned Dominican history. But rare would be the book that would take on Dominican history as something that was on the same plane of world historical importance as, say, the legacies of the Greeks and Romans, or American history, right? And rare indeed would be the American history book that talked about America's geopolitical intrusions in the Dominican Republic and the effect that those intrusions had had on my family's life, on the lives of so many Dominican Americans, on the lives of Dominicans in the diaspora, so on and so forth. And so little by little, I began to realize that all of these curricular trajectories that I was on that had put me in the position where I could study classics had also been fashioned in settings where certain kinds of histories and certain kinds of narratives had been systematically depreciated. And so the question that I found myself wrestling with as an Afro-Latino immigrant, as an undocumented immigrant, was how to simultaneously emphasize the value of what it was that I did as a classicist, which I enjoyed doing and which I found fascinating, and at the same time call attention to the fact that there were all these other histories, all these other texts, all of these cultural traditions that were menaced into silence and were subjected to the silencing effects of this historical discourse. And so that then became one of the enduring obsessions. That became really the anchor of the projects that I strove to develop after graduate school and in my own teaching now.
Right. I think that's a really important reminder of the way in which literature and the arts often literally keeps us alive. You know, it helps us to make sense of ourselves, and it helps us to actually survive. So that's really important what you're saying. Devesh, I'm curious, could you say a little bit more about your study of Indian immigrants in the US? And I'd particularly like to hear more about how you see the experience of Indian immigrants in the US in particular as being different from that of other immigrants. Is it different? Because I think that you were veering onto something like that earlier on.
Yeah, I guess, I think two things struck us. So our book is very much, driven by the data, especially from the US census. And so what surprised us when we began to look at these numbers is, one is, the highest level of education, the highest level of income, and also now the largest immigrant group coming to the US, more than Mexicans, which usually surprises most people. But as legal immigrants last 2 years, Indians are the largest new immigrants group sort of in the US, when it was completely absent, 50 years ago. And this ought to be surprising. First, it's very far. And second is, surely this can't be anything to do with India or Indians, because if that was so good, why would India be so poor to begin with? And why would they want to leave? So it had to be something else that was, shaping this. And so broadly, what we have is a story where we have about 5, 6 reasons, but very much so what you find is how immigrants come into the country matters a lot on how well they end up doing. If you come in as an undocumented, the journey is much, much harder. If you come in on a work visa, the journey is much, much easier, because not only are you already legal, but on a H-1B visa, you get the visa only if the salary is above the median American salary. So you're already above the median the day you land on the tarmac, right? And of the million plus H-1B visas given in the last 15 odd years, more than half have gone to one country, which is India. So this was the thing that was very atypical. So for instance, immigrants from China have also high levels of education, but a much greater fraction come on asylum visas. India is a democracy, you don't get these asylum visas, not that people don't try. But if you are an engineer, let's say you're two people, identical training, one comes on an H-1B visa, one comes on an asylum visa, the labor market prospects for the second person are much harder. Looking for a job, your degree is not, no one knows your degree, etc., etc. So the journey is much harder. But the core argument is really a selection story, what we call the triple selection. One is the selection within India, which is these were largely upper caste, so they had a social capital. The second is the selection, which is India's examination system, and I was part of this. You go to one of these IITs, 500,000 kids take the exam. They take anything from 2,000 when I took it to about 10,000 now, so there's a selection. And the third is a selection process of immigration into the US, which much favors those with so-called STEM backgrounds, which is degrees in science and technology, which is what, of course, these guys had much more. So, but we found that there was also an element of bad luck and good luck. The bad luck was that India did terribly in manufacturing, even when China was doing very well in manufacturing. So Indian engineers shifted to a new field called IT. It so happened that field absolutely boomed in the US. So when they came into the US, they sort of stepped into an elevator instead of having to climb up the stairs. It's not that you were good, it just so happened you came at the right time, you stepped in the elevator, and the elevator just took you up. Because if you happened to come to Silicon Valley in the early 2000s, and were an IT engineer, you would do well. But if you came as a mechanical engineer or a metallurgical engineer and joined the US steel industry, you didn't go too far because that began to collapse, right? So paradoxically, India's failures in manufacturing moved them to. And the other was, which we ended up, it so happened that the United States and India were colonized by the same country. So their English was relatively much better than many other immigrants who were coming. And we know in labor markets, language skills do play a role.
Very fascinating study, and it also helps me to realize too that, a story such as Danelle's, to put that into perspective as well, and to understand the significance of the journey that you've made. In an earlier conversation, Kayen, I heard you mentioned the migrant as being a sort of shapeshifter, I think is a term that you used. And I think that's a very useful term, actually. And I would maybe like to hear the thoughts of all of you on what it means for the migrant person to shapeshift. Can you speak some more on that?
It's again being out of context, being in a different context. You are getting an entire nation's or an entire society's projection of who you are because of how you entered, right? So if you entered in this elevator, you get a certain projection of how that society is structured to see you, whether or not that's who you are. And the same in the other way. If you enter, you know, without papers, if you enter through other means, the society is projecting a whole other set of assumptions on who you are. And you're gonna shift a little bit. And it may be for the worse, it may be for the better. It may be to say, like, who the hell are you? You know, who the hell are you to tell me who I am and what I can do, and who are the people I come from and what their value is to the whole globe? Or it could be to say, well, I better shut up and be quiet and try to participate in the way that I can so that I don't get hurt, my family doesn't get hurt. But it also, for me, it speaks to the concealed stories and the stock stories that are concealed in, again, American history that do structure the way immigrants and migrants are received in America, who is welcomed and who is, again, centralized as essential and valuable parts of our society versus who isn't. And it's so interesting that you just said that Indians are the largest immigrant group, yet our whole entire national discourse is focused on Mexico and keeping Mexicans out. Yet at the same time, post 9/11, we have in the crosshairs of our war on terror, Arab, South Asian, Muslim people, and who's some of the first people that were killed, who is the first murder, post 9/11 kind of revenge murder, was a Sikh man in Arizona, right? And so we're really, you know, it is a strange thing, and I have a line in my solo show where I talk about, the character is talking about an uncle of mine shaved his beard because he was tired of dancing with the phantom. And the idea is that you go into these spaces and you don't know how people are looking at you. And suddenly you're forced to do this weird dance of like, oh, am I okay? Is this okay here? And how should I move? And can I be comfortable? Right? And so you're forced to shapeshift. And also at the same time, you have the opportunity to shapeshift. So how I am today is probably different than how I would have been had I been raised in India in a fairly privileged family. My family's working class in the US, but in India we were middle class. I have fairer skin than others. I'm relatively tall, right? I would have had different privileges in India that might have shaped me a different way had I been raised there than here. So that the idea of shapeshifting is also opportunity. It's not only the way you shift to accommodate oppression and the way you have to move. So it's complex, you know?
Yeah. Does that resonate with you too, Daniel? Shape-shifting?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, it does. And, you know, I can't help but think of the pressures that are generated in the U.S. That corral immigrants into these narratives. And this inculcation in narrative and in the production of narrative is in the first instance worked out by the immigration service, right? As an immigrant, when you encounter the immigration service, you have to deliver an accounting of yourself, and depending on the adjustment of status for which you're applying, depending on the visa for which you're applying if you're entering the US, or the family members you might be petitioning for if you're trying to bring family into the country. And you get this crash course in the kinds of narratives that are acceptable to the authority at the other across the desk from you, and the kinds of narratives that are not acceptable or that are frowned upon. I was reading a few months ago Valeria Luiselli's Tell Me How It Ends, which is fantastic on this issue, because what Luiselli chronicles are the predicaments of refugee and asylum-seeking children who cross the southern border coming in from Central America. And as part of the process of adjudicating the merit of their applications, they have to, with the assistance sometimes of translators and lawyers, fill out these applications that direct at them a volley of questions, many of which children, and I mean that literally children who are so young, who quite frequently come unaccompanied, are no position to answer. These are the kinds of questions that ultimately rely on forcing children already to buy into certain narratives about responsibility and about the responsibility of parents and of those who are contributing to their migration flow up into the country. And these children are receiving a crash course in what it means to conciliate or humor the immigration authorities, and what the stakes of failing to do this are, because if you fail, If you are not persuasive, you get kicked out. Simple as that. So this all brings me now to a story of shapeshifting of a kind, which is that last year I had a green card interview. I was the beneficiary of a spousal petition to adjust status after having used up my work authorization time under a student visa. And my wife and I know everything there is to know about each other. And so we weren't worried about that when we arrived at the visa room, at the interview room. But the questions that I began to get were such that it was difficult to avoid laughing at them. And yet we both knew that, to laugh in the face of this immigration officer would be to court disaster, right? And so, but at one point my wife just couldn't help it, right? I was asked point blank, have you ever killed someone? And my wife just burst into laughter, right? Because the thought that at this moment, at this crucial moment on my journey to a green card, that I would say, actually I forgot to indicate this on my adjustment of status form, but I murdered someone. My wife just thought this is unbelievable. Why is we asked? And so, and the immigration officer cast us a very stern look, right? And so that was the moment of disciplining, right? That was when we were being conditioned into a certain modality of presentation. Then there was another moment when I was asked if I'd ever received advanced weapons training, at which I repressed successfully a giggle, but again, it was very difficult for us to keep this in. But through the litany of questions that are constructed as part of the process through which immigrants change status in the United States, you are taught to perform. And that teaching in performance unfolds in many other contexts too, and we can talk about those possibly during the Q&A, but it is the immigration system's capacity to direct and funnel immigrants in certain ways, and to really socialize them into a kind of performance that can, in the long term, as Luiselli's book shows, be deleterious to their own psychological health and well-being, that we should be talking about when we talk about the interface of the migration state and the adjustments of immigrants to their new countries.
I remember those very invasive questions as well. I'm remembering that now. So yeah, it is quite shocking, disturbing, takes you off guard, and it does push you into this shapeshifter mode of sorts. Thank you for sharing that. So I think we're moving to Q&A in a few minutes, but I just have one other question that I wanted to get in quickly. But before that, Devesh, did you have something that you wanted to contribute on this notion of shapeshifting too?
So I think one way that in my own work, sort of increasingly, I'm sort of looking at is sort of the cognitive shifts that occur among or within migrants. Because migrants bring with them a certain set of beliefs and practices. And they move to a society which has different sets of beliefs and practices. So you can take something very simple like fertility and gender relationships, which are actually very different, especially when people come from many countries of the global south to countries of the global north. I'll give you an example to illustrate this. In the late 1970s, early 80s, the demographers at the UN were like projecting fertility changes in Egypt and Morocco. Egypt had higher income, higher female literacy, which usually portends a faster decline in fertility. 30 years later, when they went back, the opposite had happened. Fertility rates had declined much more sharply in Morocco than in Egypt. And what they sort of learned was actually migration from Morocco was much more to France and Spain. Migration from Egypt was much more to the Gulf and Saudi Arabia. The migrants imbibed the fertility norms of the societies they moved into, and because they send remittances back, which is money, but all that money also, what flows back is also ideas that flow back. And that was an important reason why fertility decline in Morocco was much faster. Now that gives you both the power of ideas and these cognitive shifts that occur. Some may be less good good or bad is not the point. But the larger point is, I think, that this shape shifts occur also in the mind and of the migrant about, quote, the right or correct practices.
Right. Thank you. On that note, I think that we should just enter into our audience Q&A. Are there any questions here? What's that? A few, yeah.
Okay. Hi. So my name's Lisa. I was wondering if each one of the panelists could sort of offer psychological insight to more of the effect of this sort of preposterous, audacious, personally violating questions and experience that are sort of the shrinking of your person to fit into a keyhole.
Well, I mean, nowadays, and this is clearly one of the consequences of being habituated into the system. I mean, now I can't help but laugh at these instances and incidents, right? But the psychological distress that accompanied this for so much of my life was, at points, almost unbearable. Right? And I developed, and my family members developed, people I knew developed, all of these complex coping mechanisms to bury deep in our minds the memories of these kinds of encounters, right? I mean, you'd really have to excavate our minds in order to retrieve all of this so densely sedimented texture of the many, many encounters we had that contributed to these acts, small and not so small, of degrading the immigrant self, right? So that does, though, bring me to what I think is an invitation or an opportunity of sorts. I'm not the kind of person who would normally say, well, take lemons and make lemonade or whatever, but so because the memories associated with these encounters with the system are so traumatic, it is difficult to revisit them without re-experiencing one's trauma. The downside to this, though, and this is where I think the performative arts have a very special role to play, is that if those memories are not revisited, they are forgotten, right? And so we are living, I think, in this moment where it has become possible for significant sectors of the population to entertain the fantasy that their ancestors, their grandparents, even their parents, were not subjected to the degradations of an immigration protocol. That their grandparents or great-grandparents weren't felt up at Ellis Island and checked and subject to the biopolitical surveillance techniques then being developed that have now reached their efflorescence and fulfillment in the 21st century. And so to reactivate that for people, to get them to think about the implications of this, how this is embedded in a historical arc that directly touched the lives of their kin, would, I think, be excellent for the contemporary moment. But because so many of these memories are steeped in trauma, we need the interlocutionary forces of, say, the arts to do this. We need the work of fiction and nonfiction to do this. And that, I think, is one way of taking these experiences and making them civically useful and making them contribute to what is, in the end, a practice of liberation, right? I mean, this is what we should be tending to. So,
and I'll just add to that, in that a lot of the work that I do around using the arts and telling these stories is not only to reflect and remember, right, but to also understand that we have moved forward, that we do have power. There was a time that we were powerless, whether it's a situation, a momentary situation, or a more extended part of our lives, but to also understand that we may have power now that we don't, and to understand that, you know, we have been informed by something towards, as Danielle says, towards working for liberation. And I truly believe that the arts do offer us an alternative civic convening space. And now, more than ever, because our civic spaces to truly deliberate and dialogue are shrinking and are getting much smaller, that the arts need to step up more and recognize that convening power that the arts have in bringing people together. I mean, look at the constitution of this audience and who's on stage. This is a new social relationship. You know, so many of the arts organizations I'm involved with are like obsessed with like equity and diversity. I've never heard one thing in the JLF you know, advertising or marketing talking about equity and diversity, yet here it is. You all have performed a role to come out and see authors and writers and thinkers of different parts of the world, of different, you know, with different backgrounds. You have chosen that. You are enacting a different role than most people in society are. And so we have to really think about these everyday ways that we can transform this role. I'm interested in, you know, what makes someone look at me and ask a pretty dumb or insulting question? Like, what's going on with you that you can't see me? Or that you can't even just like ask a question before thinking that you know who I am. You know, like there's, you know, so a lot of times when people will say something, you know, ignorant or hurtful, you know, I might interject a question before, like, hi, how are you? You know, how'd you get here today? You know, and it's really, you know, it's amazing the ways in which racism, sexism, classism, all these isms that are affecting our relations, you know, take on shape in our bodies, how we relate to one another. Even when I'm relating to white people, the effect that those traumas have had on me is to question the motive of a white person who's being nice to me. That's awful. You know, like there's a human being kind to me, and suddenly I think, well, what do you want? You know, that's fucked up.
If I may just interject on my colleagues' remarks, you know, I think I do have an sympathy for the immigration officer. And I'll tell you why. If you see who they are, you know, they've got, this is the one job they have. They've not designed the rules. And I wonder how they think when they ask these questions. In some ways, they are as much part of a system, they are victims. You know, these are not people with deep pockets living privileged lives. These are people who the system has forced them to do sort of impossible tasks, where they are as themselves imprisoned in the system, and they have to ask questions. You know, I always presume that the person asking me is also a thinking person. And they must be thinking, you know, what sort of question is it to ask this gentleman, did you kill someone, right? But I also want to emphasize this is not just about the US. I don't go to conferences in Europe. The type of questions they ask, I mean, I was invited by the German government to a conference on migration. I have to go to New York to get a visa, and I have to show that if I die, I have insurance that my body can be shipped back. Now, this is a conference of 24 hours. You know, I just go in and come back, and I'm thinking, you know, is there something they know about my health that I don't? But, you know, it's that sort of thing. Now, that person said, no, you don't have that insurance, no visa. And then, of course, I said I won't go, and the German government, they called me to come. And I was very candid that the only way I would come to their country was in a coffin. But you see that it's sometimes hard to think about these lower level functionaries. That's the job they have. You know, they, I'm sure, are also struggling in their lives in their own ways. And I wonder, sometimes we ask, how do they feel about it? And I'm sure, you know, for some, I'm sure it's a power trip. But they are as much sort of caught in this vice, so to speak. that they are, struggling.
I think in the I often think that in the spirit of great literature, I'd also like to give government officials a reading list of required material. So, did you want to answer that question too?
No, I mean, I just think it's interesting. I have a character in my solo show who is an INS agent or DSS agent who was participating post 9/11. There was a program called Special Registrations where men on visas from 15 different countries, mostly Muslim nations and North Korea, had to re-register themselves. They had valid visas, they were here, but they had to re-register themselves. And in the process, many were arbitrarily detained for months and months and months with no legal recourse. This was, what we call the first kind of Muslim registry. And so I have a character who is the INS agent who is registering people. And at that time, part of the research I was doing was looking at how the government was systematically actually de-unionizing and lowering the wages of these workers, TSA and DHS workers, so that they would kind of feel pressed, they would feel desperate, and it makes it easier for them to participate in their role. They are less likely to subvert their role if they feel like I'm going to be fired at any moment or I can be in trouble at any moment and I am overworked. And when I'm overworked, I'm less likely to be compassionate and look at someone and try to process them in a more thoughtful way, right? I'm just like get the hell to the back of the line, like, don't talk to me. I don't care if that's your son, get the hell out of here, and that's, that was who that character was. She was complaining about her overtime. And then she had a moment of like, what terrorist is going to wait in line for 10 hours to register with the government?
Last words, Daniel.
Yeah, I too would want, and this is not to pick up the Trump question, I'd want to talk him through some of the texts that have contributed to not just my sort of sense of self as an immigrant, but that have also opened my eyes to how power works asymmetrically to dehumanize or to try to dehumanize me by having me dehumanize folks like immigration officers, right? David Foster Wallace's last novelistic project was about IRS agents, but I think we do need more projects that focus on folks involved in CBP, folks involved in the DHS mechanism, folks involved at USCIS offices, and who are in their own various ways subject to the menaces of the state, right? The state that tells them you have to keep this minimum number of immigrants in detention to meet the nightly bed quotas. And I mean, I would probably work, if I could, if he were patient enough, I would work our commander-in-chief through some Kafka. I remember, I vividly remember the day that I picked up the trial and I started reading the trial. Because I read the trial almost in one sitting. I took a break at one point because I really had to go to the bathroom. I had, up to that point, not found a text that spoke to me about the opacities of bureaucracy with nearly the same sort of elegance and sort of searing, searching qualities that novel had. The other text, though, and this now gets me finally to think about the relationship between dehumanization and invisibility that I would have our commander-in-chief do some walking in the park with, is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, right? And with that text, I would try to communicate 2 points. One is obviously the predicament of those who are rendered invisible by the operations of the racial apparatus, the carceral apparatus, the racial carceral apparatus. But at the same time, the forms of invisibility that are foisted upon those who are the wardens and the gatekeepers of this apparatus. How their feelings are and how what I am sure their many, many hesitations are about participating in this system are forced into are shoved back into the recesses of their active day-to-day experiences, because for them too it must be nearly impossible to cope with some of the punishments that they have to dole out. What is it like to be an immigration judge who has hundreds of cases to work through and who knows that he or she cannot devote more than, say, 5 minutes to them at a time? That's what I would want, to use text as a way of imagining. In dialogue with the person who might not want to have dialogue with me, but that's another issue.
Thank you. So we'll end on the note of the uses and power of literature. And thank you, all of our wonderful panelists, and thank you, audience.